Hi, future doomer bloomers. This is Will S. The podcast episode you're about to hear with Kai Whiting will take a odd turn about 2/3 of the way through the interview. We were supposed to talk about Stoicism, Zeno, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, his new book. However, Kai brought out the fact that, Will or myself, I've been doing this podcast for close to 2 years now, and it's becoming a community. I would like the Doomer Bloomer podcast to become a community. So if you're listening to this right now, bear with me. I get a little raw, real. I ask for your help and support in building this community. I am very approachable, and that doesn't necessarily mean money necessarily. Just engage with me on my social medias, share, and subscribe to my newsletter. If you're capable or able to, please consider donating $10 to my GoFundMe page. Consider becoming a monthly subscriber to my Patreon. It's only $7.50 Canadian. You're going to get some Doomer Bloomer swag. If you want physical objects sent to you, the TeePublic store is the place to go. There's 3 different logo variations you can get. You got King Doomer, regular old Doomer, and sophisticated Doomer. I love you all. And the other place I would love you to engage is my new Discord server that I've set up. Free content will be flowing there as well. I've got a bunch of resources set up for people who would like to start their own podcasts, YouTube channels, get started in this space. And it's a labor of love, and it starts with you guys. It's not all about me. I'm just a facilitator of this community, and I want it to grow and become a place for positive change in the world. I see what's happening with the COVID-19 situation, and I think that we really need this right now. So help me rally, build a community between and bridges between the islands. Flow me interesting guests and help me get onto other podcasts that you already listen to. If you're already listening to podcasts, I know you're listening to other ones. Help me get onto those podcasts. And that is how we get this snowball effect rocking back and forth. It gets a little bit of more momentum, and it starts picking up speed, rolling downhill, and eventually it becomes a self-sustaining engine where we can start doing even better things, maybe starting a charitable foundation, something like that. Haven't really decided, but let's try and, at least 3x this year and get some interesting guests, interesting perspectives, get me, get the Doomer Bloomer raised up another plateau, and really become a true collective of like-minded, forward-thinking, multi-denominational, multicultural, multi-sexuality, force for positive change in the world. This is your loving green dragon protector, Will S. And please follow, like, and subscribe. Namaste. Peace. The Doomer Bloomer podcast is about the resurrection of good ideas. We profile the hero's journey in weekly episodes and teach people about the 10 pillars framework for success in life, business, and relationships. Our goal is to find and help all doomer bloomers with mental health issues, poverty mindset, lack of resources, and those left behind in this world. Tune in weekly with Will S. and occasionally John Wynn as we have deep conversations with guests about the hero's journey, clown world order, and the resurrection of good ideas. To help support the show, go to www.thedoomerbloomerpodcast.com to become a member today. And we're live. Welcome back to the Doomer Bloomer podcast with Will S. We're talking about the hero's journey in weekly episodes, the 10 pillars framework for success, life, business, and relationships. We're talking about health, wealth, virtue, love, art, freedom, travel, peace, integrity, and charity. Today on the podcast, I have a gentleman all the way from the UK, but now currently living in Lisbon, Portugal. His name is Kai Whiting, and he is a professor of Stoicism. How are you doing today, Kai?
I'm doing great, actually. I'm enjoying. I was just really enjoying our conversation just as we started, and I'm really looking forward to this interview. Actually, it's great to branch out into different kinds of podcasts, and this is like a toe in the water to see, like, okay, what about in the more general sense, away from sort of very sort of stoic or focused podcasts. So I'm really looking forward to this one.
Yeah, this is going to be an open forum. We're going to kind of do like a 100-mile view and then kind of like go down a little bit deeper on some of the concepts. And we're going to go back and forth here. So just to kick it off here, where are you on your hero's journey, your doomer to bloomer path? Kind of briefly tell us your story, Kai, and if you want to talk about your book, you're more than welcome to.
So I actually do open this story up in Being Better, Stoicism for a World Worth Living In, which is the book that I've just launched, or has been launched. I didn't launch it, and it starts with my grandma, right? And I was based in Portugal at the time, so we're talking like 5 years ago now. And I get a phone call. I just did an exam, actually. I did an exam in environment and energy. So I come back home, I'm absolutely exhausted, and there's an electricity cut. My house is completely black. We have like a torch on my head. I have a torch on my head. There's no lighting. And I didn't have a phone at the time because I felt like phones were just distracting. So I didn't have a mobile phone or anything, which is quite unusual. So like my partner's phone goes off and off and off. And I'm like, what is going on? And I pick up the phone and go, because I can see it's my mum going, hi mum, what are you calling me for? She's like, why don't you have a phone? I'm like, because it just is a distraction. She's like, okay, you need to speak to my sister. So I get on the phone to her thinking, what's going on? She's like, can you sit down, please? I'm like, yeah. And she's like, I didn't want to tell you this, but, your nan or your grandma, she's dying. And you have to get a flight right now. I'm like, I actually can't get a flight right now. And they're like, why not? I'm like, I don't have any electricity in my house. Like, there's a car. Like, you need to book it right this minute. I'm like, I literally cannot, right? Trying to work out, like, what can I do? It's like, when you say she's dying, like, how quickly is she dying? And they're like, pretty quick. Like, it's unlikely. There is, this opportunity for surgery, but it's not going to look, it's like not even a 50-50 thing. If she survives it, it's less than a 50-50 thing. Please get on the next flight. So I'm sitting there in the darkness with this torch in my head going, what on earth I can't do anything. I literally, I'm not going into, I didn't even react because I couldn't react. So when I do finally get my electricity back on, because it wasn't just my house, the whole street, I get the flight and I go in. And I actually started to read something called Ryan Holiday's Obstacle is the Way. Because when you're
I love that book.
It's a brilliant book. And when you're in a hospital, you have a lot of time to read, right? So I bought it and just thought, she's going to survive. Like, I know she's going to survive. She's a fighter. She'll survive. And there's one line that says that your observation and your perception are two different things. And Ryan talks very much about death is the thing you can't control. And so I'm literally reading that, more or less reading that line. It must be 3 or 4 pages after that line we actually get the news that she didn't make it. And I just watched the room. Like the room was like the oxygen had been sucked out of it. Everybody's hopes and dreams had gone in that moment because people called her like, they said she was like the godmother in the Godfather film. She was like the rock that everybody else stood on. And it is true that the connection in the family has definitely weakened and it's created new things. There's been new developments in my family, but the rock that we had stood on was no longer there. And I just literally watched the room and I didn't know what to think. I was like, what's the fact? She's died. Is that bad? And I was trying to work that out. I was like, is that bad? And it just surprised me, like, is death bad? And I was like going through it and I was feeling a bit guilty because I was watching everybody else. Once the oxygen had been sucked out of the room, I watched as it fell on people. And it's horrible for me to remember this in a way because it's my family members, but I just watched it sort of sink in. And it wasn't sinking in at that moment. It sank in later. But for me at that moment, it didn't sink in because I was just so reflecting on what it meant because it was such a critical moment in my life to be reading like the difference between observation and perception. And if it had been any other circumstance, I probably would have been like, yeah, that's cool. And like reflect on it very little. But because it was literally such a raw moment, I had no choice but to sort of like, what do I do now? Do I practice this? Or do I just, blink and just carry on the next page? And I definitely reacted better than I would have done had I not read that particular chapter, that particular moment in time. And then so 2 years later, I'm happy to read How to Be a Stoic. And I find out my granddad is dying. And I'm actually traveling. I'm in the UK at this time, but I'm actually on holiday. But I'm not in the area where my family is. I'm in the opposite side of the country. I know it's a small country, but I was the opposite side. And I'm like, really? And I didn't know that he was, I had no warning that he was really ill. So I was like, oh. So it was like these two different moments in my life that I really thought, I did think he would die because he was weaker. My grandma had never been ill before, so I'd never seen that. Well, she had it as a child, but I'd never seen it. So it was like, okay, if Stoicism can help me at that moment where, basically the core of the essence of the family has moved. It hasn't ripped away, but it's moved, it's shifted. What else can Stoicism help me with? Because I often say that if your philosophy can't help you when you're at either your lowest point or your hardest point, like I have said this quite controversially, like if you're in a prison cell, and you're thinking like, should I kill myself or not? Because I'm so low. If Stoicism can't answer that question for you in terms of working it through, what is it for?
Right.
That's what Stoicism is for me.
Right. And those, like, for those of us not familiar with what Stoicism is, because not all of us are as well read as some others, but where was Stoicism founded and who was it founded by?
That's an excellent question. So although we talked about Ryan Holiday, that's a very contemporary sort of book about Stoicism. Stoicism is actually far, far older. It's an ancient Greek/Roman philosophy established 2,000 years ago by Zeno of Citium. And Zeno is a really interesting character. We did talk about him in chapter 1 because unlike sort of the American dream where you kind of become significant and important once you become a business entrepreneur, Zeno was a business entrepreneur, and the opposite happened. He actually becomes really significant and important when everything he has literally washes away in the sea, because he was a merchant and he had bought a really rare and expensive dye that only the emperors used for their clothing, or Seneca would probably use it on his collar. And at the moment where you'd think today, okay, I have money, I'm wealthy, I have a really expensive wares, I'm going to be really important. He's sitting there on the boat, I imagine, thinking all these things, and the ship gets dashed, goes all into the sea. Everything that is his identity, all his money, he probably borrowed money. He's sitting on the docks in Athens, going, probably, how do I even get home to Cyprus? I have not even got a penny to my name. Everything I had, I invested. People are going to be angry with me. I can't pay it back, and he's just completely at loss. And he says, like, what do I do? And he actually goes to the oracle, and she gives him an answer, which I won't spoil. But the idea that once in the US and to a certain extent in the UK, that once you are a business entrepreneur and you are successful in terms of wealth and status, that's when you become, that's when you're famous, that's when you're important. And Gino's like, no, like I found myself. I found the way when I lost everything, which is kind of ironic when you think of the Silicon Valley.
So he sounds like the original doomer, my friend.
On some
Because
level, yeah.
because that's how doomers feel, dude. They feel completely lost, and they feel like they have no power. So that's Zeno is original doomer.
Yeah, I would say that certainly when he's sitting in Athens and he's probably got all his clothes ripped, and he's like, okay, I'm alive, because there's a realization I could have died, and then you just don't know what to do. You have like no idea what you can do about it, because there's just nowhere you can go, and that's why he says, okay, who is the wisest person? Who is the wisest person in Greece? And that was the Oracle. I know we use the Oracle in The Matrix, so if you have watched The Matrix, the kind of idea that she knows a lot of things about how the world really works, you can kind of see that as the Oracle in Zeno's time. So he's like, how do I, what do I do? And he goes to the Oracle, and again, I won't spoil the story too much, but the idea is he sets about working out what does happiness mean. So you're very much right about the doom of bloomer. At the moment that you are in that doom phase, it's like you suddenly have to, you basically, in my view, hit a wall, and you have to look at what are my priorities, right? What matters to me? What is my core being? What is it that I really value? And how do I get that? How do I get there? And that is the essence of your hero's, right? Hero's journey. That is your essence of this podcast, because this podcast doesn't exist if everyone's really happy and we're like, okay, I have everything I want, and I didn't really have to work hard, and I know exactly who I am. And some people, they might have that, but you're taking people going like, no, you are lost, like for that moment. But if you just can look into yourself and ask yourself who you are,
And I'm gonna say that you're gonna have multiple doomer phases of your life, and you're gonna have multiple bloomer phases of your life, because it's more like a sine wave where it goes up and then goes down and then goes up and then goes down, and a very cyclical, very cyclical. Life is cyclical. The doomer bloomer phase is cyclical, and you're gonna go through that throughout your life, but that is more from Taoism, from what I've learned. The cycle of life. Every storm there is a calm, and every calm there is a storm. But I like Stoicism because it preaches action, and it talks about what is in your control and what is out of your control, right? And coming back to the story about your nan, like, what was in your control during that situation, Guy?
Ooh, I don't think anybody's actually asked me that. And I've told the story, but that's a very good question. At that moment, the only thing I could control was how I reacted. I couldn't do anything else. I hadn't done the, Stoicism research, and this is sort of one of my pet frustrations with modern contemporary Stoic literature, is that we focus a lot on what is in your control and what isn't, but we don't actually form the virtues. Like the whole thing of Stoicism rests on the virtues, and obstacle is the way. You don't really hear about that, and there's no problem about that, because it's not an academic book, and it's not necessarily saying this is a Stoic book. What it's saying actually, obstacles way, is that this book is influenced by Stoicism. So it's not a criticism in true sense. But one of my core frustrations is that we don't put the basis as virtue. So I didn't have that. I didn't have that understanding. So we go back to that in a minute. But it was like all I can do is channel like my emotions into something useful, and that launched what became like the desire to work in Stoicism and be an author, because I wanted to show like my nan on some level. I must do to show her like I believed in your message and you've gone, but I'm carrying that message on, and that was the only thing I could do. I'm not a doctor. Well, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a PhD doctor, which was not particularly useful in a hospital. I couldn't. There was no words of comfort I can give my family. There was nothing I could say, because literally there was nothing I could do or say or think that was going to change how other people reacted. And that's quite hard when your loved ones are in pain. It's actually one of my favorite and most difficult memories is my sister's tears, because it's just such a raw emotion. And I knew I couldn't do anything. And I just knew how she felt. I didn't express it in the same way, but we had this like understanding. So I had very little. I mean, just Stoicism says it's like your thoughts, your actions, and your attitude, and that was it.
Say that one more time,
So
slower.
sorry, I said that again. So Stoicism says it's your thoughts, your actions, and your attitudes that are in your
Hmm.
control. That's it. There's nothing else.
And it's important to understand that your observations and your thoughts are independent.
Absolutely. I wish more people did that. So I have a question for you. Like, when do you think, like, in your past, if you had known about this perception observation thing, where you would have think this would have been really useful had I really focused on it? Like, you might have known it academically or in theory, but if you'd really grabbed it, or did you have a situation where you did grab it and it was really helpful?
Well, to be honest, I really didn't get I didn't really get deeper into Stoicism until I was 25 to 27. If I had have had these like lessons in quotation marks at the age of 18 to 21, I think I would have probably shortened my doomer phase. But just because of my own personal upbringing, my thoughts and observations became my reality. And I thought my thoughts and observation dictated my reality. I didn't know how to separate the two from each other. And I kind of just compartmentalized that for a long period of time until it became apparent that it was something I needed to deal with in my middle 20s. So after the age of about 24 to 27, like I had another doomer phase, where I was unemployed and I was searching for my meaning, and I was like couch surfing at my relatives a lot, just because like I was an electrician by trade, and during that time, like trying to find work because of the oil crisis in 2014, 2015. Um, there was just like I thought at the time there were certain things out of my control. So what happens to me during my doomer phases is I become very introspective, and I start, and you could call it introspective depression, whatever you want to call it, but I start going back to the basics and be like, okay, what have I read that makes sense? What's not making sense? And I kind of, I call it save the rest and fuck the rest. Save the best and fuck the rest. And because there's different things you can pick and choose, and you can kind of build your own. I would call it like I'm going to come up with the doomer bloomer curriculum very shortly here, and I'm going to start having my own school. Like it's going to be called the Doomer Bloomer Collective or something of that nature. I haven't really decided how, but it's basically my my self reflections for the last 10 years from the age of 21 to 31, and the curriculum that I had to build for myself in order to become the person. And I'm still working on it. We're all works in progress. But I glommed onto Stoicism because it's a philosophy that preaches action, that you at the very least you should get up every day and remember, like Marcus Aurelius says, that we're human beings and you have to do the work. Human beings are meant to do work. And he is the Stoic that I most resonate with. I'm not very much of a fan of Epicureanism. Epictetus, I don't mind. I've read a little bit of discourses from Epictetus. But we live in an Epicurean society already. It's very hedonistic, and I don't think we should be doing things for just the express pleasure of doing things. I think we already have too much addiction to social media, Facebook. As you mentioned earlier, you didn't have a phone back then. I would love a time when I didn't have to look at my phone. If I could go back to the year 2005 before I had a smartphone, that was probably the happiest times of my life, to be honest. And I wasn't on social media, and I didn't have Facebook before 2007. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's pretty much my life history in a nutshell.
I think I have a follow-on question actually, because you said something that really resonates, I think, for the audience. The idea of like, I mean, I watched a very famous interview. It's talked about my truth. Right? There was a very famous interview recently that caused a lot of stir between the US and the UK. Don't need to name names, but what I will say is that there was a lot about my truth and validation of one's feelings as if their feelings were true. And I think you hit the nail right on the head. That there is this problem in society where we think that if I have a trigger, right, it's your problem. You need to accommodate my triggers. You
Well,
need to accommodate.
I call that there's a word for that. You just because I have an opinion, my opinion is doesn't mean that you choose to be offended by that opinion. You take offense by it. If I say, for example, trans people are just gay, well, trans people are just gay. That's my opinion. If you should choose to take offense that trans people are gay, well, that is your thought and your observation, and I have a separate thought and a separate observation. But they're not necessarily incompatible. But if you choose to be offended by what I said, that is actually your problem and not mine.
And it's not very conducive to finding a solution, because basically when people get offended, that doesn't necessarily or even inherently change the law or change
No,
the discourse. And
no.
that's the biggest problem I think we're facing in the English speaking world, because it's not something, when I speak in Portuguese and Spanish, we don't have this problem. Like, this concept doesn't exist. And it's really funny because if you're an English speaker and you only speak English, like on a regular basis, you only speak English, you kind of think that's where the world's going. And it's such a
No,
silly mindset. It's like, that's actually just a UK US phenomenon. Like, this doesn't happen in Spain. This doesn't happen in Portugal. It's not happening in Latin America. And it's just really interesting. And you're absolutely right. Like, your opinion could actually be wrong, and that's fine. I mean, there's not
I'm okay. I'm okay to be proven wrong. Prove me wrong. I
exactly.
don't care.
And but I don't think people are taking those conversations in that direction, are they?
No,
They-
and that's part of the reason why me and John, my partner, started this podcast in the first place, is because we've seen what was going on in popular culture. We call it clown world order, and we see this. We call this. We have a whole episode. It's devoted to clown world order. So we have hardcore right people, and we have hardcore left people. There's no moderate people anymore. But at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We have basic needs. We need food, we need shelter, and we need security. Those are the three basic human elemental needs. Okay? You can't live if you don't have food, you can't live if you don't have a shelter, and you can't live if you can't secure yourself. Right? At our base core, we're all human beings, and we're actually really running on primal instincts from the animal kingdom. If you look at the way that our brain structure is built, it's built from the reptilian stem and runs up to the mammalian, and then the neocortex is the final straw of the structure of the brain. So at our base core, we have reptilian needs, and those are basically food, sex, and greed. Those are the three things that people actually make decisions in their hindbrain all the time. But I only know this because I study psychology and I am in sales and marketing.
I think, yeah, that's the other thing. Like, we allow ourselves as again, it's not even a global society thing, but also, certainly I might say, I don't even think Canada is that bad, but certainly in the US and the UK, we're just walking and running around thinking that someone has an opinion and that opinion is fact, and that we need to accommodate that opinion as if it were fact, and that's a very, very dangerous thing to do. Stoicism really talks about, okay, so the perception and observation. Okay, what is true? Because Zeno's main message is live according to nature, right? And by nature, he means your own nature and the nature around you, as in it's a demonstrable fact. So all of your decisions in Stoicism is about vice and virtue. So the virtues are courage, self-control, justice, and wisdom. And every decision
Right.
you make should be but standing on those principles. So greed is actually a vice, and so greed is not good. And if you don't understand those four principles, and you don't understand what's true, as in what's actually,
Can you just repeat the four principles but slower?
Of course, sorry, I get carried away. Sorry about that. Yeah, the four virtues. So there's four virtues in Stoicism: courage, justice, self-control, and wisdom.
Right.
And they're good. They are the only good in Stoicism. There is nothing else that is completely and utterly good. Because regardless of what circumstance you're in, you are going to want more justice. You're not going to say, you know what, today, Will, I want less justice. That's exactly what we need in this world. It will always, always be good. And the polar opposites, the vices, will always be bad. So let me give you a really hardcore example. People say that slavery is bad, right? In Stoicism,
Go ahead.
in Stoicism, you say it's an indifferent. Why is it indifferent? Because if I give you a choice between dying, as in I'll kill you, or I enslave you, you might choose slavery. You might say, I prefer to be your slave, then you kill me. So I actually think that's the better choice out of those two, right? That's why slavery is an indifferent, because it depends on the circumstances that you would say, actually, I prefer to be your slave if the option is something else. Whereas if it's a virtue, you're never going to go, yeah, you know what, I prefer injustice. You're always going to prefer justice regardless of the circumstance. So that's quite critical. In society, we don't really understand the essence of Stoicism until we get that. Like, really, slavery in most circumstances is a very, very negative thing. But if I give you that choice, you might see it as a slightly more positive thing than the other alternative. And the problem is that if you don't understand these four virtues, and you don't understand the need to tie your reality to facts, and there's a lot of people who don't, then you actually get really emotional, you get triggered, and you start throwing your triggers onto other people. And that
my dad calls that the emotion ocean.
And it's very deep, actually. He's right to call it that. Go on, tell me more. Why do you think he says that?
Because if you start becoming a slave to your emotions, you're just gonna start rolling in on the waves of your emotion. But you need to actually start surfing those waves. You need to get on top of the waves like a true if you're charting your own destiny, you need to get on top of those waves and surf them. You're still going to have them, but you're going to be the surfer of your own emotion ocean. You're not going to let those waves keep pounding you and pounding you and pounding you over and over. And you're going to use your thoughts and observations in tandem to, as you said earlier, find the truth and tie that to fact. Not just accept everything at face value, but be very discerning. And does my opinion match yours? Yes, no. Do I have a bias towards that? Yes, no. We all have these cognitive biases, and we have to navigate that all of the time. And I consider myself a fairly moderate person, but someone from the far left would call me a conservative. Well, part of me is maybe a conservative, but I wouldn't call myself a conservative because I don't put myself into one quotation marks, one pigeonhole, or one. I'm looking at all these different philosophies, whether it be Taoism, Stoicism, leftism. Like, I'm taking the best. Like I said, I take the best and I fuck the rest. It's at that you know what I mean?
I think that I really, really like your dad's analogy, or what you've just built on, whether it's yours or your dad's, where you literally, that is right. You either get sucked in by the current and then squirm and hope someone rescues you, which I call, and you probably do as well, victim culture, which is really attractive. Which is really attractive until nobody wants to rescue anymore because it's just too difficult. And there's a lot of victim culture. I see it all the time. I see a lot of weaponization of identity everywhere. And it's like, when I was a kid, mum was like, okay, never use any of your, physical characteristics to say you can't do something. Always do your best, right? With the victim culture, it's kind of like, I've been thinking about this a lot. It's kind of like, it's the race to the bottom. It's like, who is the worst victim? Who has been victimized the most? Let's race to the bottom. And Stoicism says, no, let's race to the top. Let's stand on these virtues.
Mm-hmm.
And the concept of cosmopolitanism, which is everybody is part of community and society, and we should work together. That is race to the top. Let's grab the handle and bring up the next man or woman. In the victim culture, I see let's kick down the next person. Let's kick them from their pedestal that someone else put them on normally, and let's kick down a bit harder. And when that doesn't work, let's react in a very sort of vicious, in the Stoic sense, a very sort of unjust way, and then see how much of this victim culture that I can sort of suck into myself so that other people feel sorry for me. The problem with that is that it's completely out of your control, because you can't control if people will feel sorry for you or not. But you're right, because you can control the surfboard. So whilst you can't control the waves, and a surfboard is very precarious. I'm going to steal your analogy. You can see it. You can move your feet and your balance to ride the wave. And I think that's I will steal it. You're going to hear that in another podcast. And that's an excellent analogy, because that's exactly what we need to do. And it's not just Stoicism that teaches that. I think religious principles, and for example, Christianity also teaches that, to stand on the surfboard of Jesus, right? I wouldn't say it's exactly the same surfboard.
Well, and here's the thing: like Doomer Bloomer is non-denominational. We accept all creeds, all cultures, all backgrounds. We treat everybody the same and equally. Because I think it's all I think realistically it's all versions of the same thing that's been distilled through some sort of grand universal colander, and those different strands have been disseminated through the human population, because we're actually celestial beings having a human experience, and we're actually trying to connect with infinite intelligence. It's just we are not fourth dimensional, so we cannot perceive it the way that a universal being would. So it has to flow down to us in a way that's understandable. So whether it's Christianity, monotheism, or multi-god religions, whether it's Stoicism, Taoism, Buddhism, what Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, right? Put a colander on your head and say it, I'm a Pastafarian now. I used to say that all the time. What's your religion? I'm a Pastafarian. Like, I think I'll use that next time I get pulled over by the cops. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, who really cares? You're a human being you're a celestial being having a human experience, and you're trying to make the best of the world, make your way in the world. And it's hard enough already. So as you mentioned earlier, with this victim mindset nonsense, or like, as I like to say, bullshit, stop kicking people down and let's start helping the next guy up. And we get to the next step of the pyramid, and we build the next ladder to the next step, and so on and so forth. Right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's how civilization has grown. I mean, I'm not saying that there's no, that we shouldn't, I'm not saying let's, just help people up, and not really think about what we're doing. That's what Stoicism is all about. Okay, think about who you are, where you are, what your skill set is, and use it.
Right.
So, for example, you said you're an electrician. So in Stoicism, and if you're an electrician, what do you have to do? Well, you have to know about electricity. You have to know what's safe, what's unsafe, what's needed in my house, what's not needed, to be fair in your pricing, to be fair in your discussion about what I need and what I don't need. If solar panels, for example, really are for me, if my consumption is sufficient to warrant that, if it's the not cheapest but the most reasonable, because cheap is not necessarily the most reasonable, but that's the most reasonable option. Or you might say, what, Kai, you'd be better off in installing something else, like something on top of your roof that will heat the water, because your main use or concern is having a warm shower once a day. So as in your role in Stoicism, it says, okay, what are your preferences? So what do you like doing? What is your knowledge? So if you're an electrician, what do you know? And how can you use that knowledge and your ability to use what's in your control to do the right thing for the right reason at the right moment? Because, for example, if you and I see somebody in the street and they're ill, we're not doctors. So if we try to do something extreme towards them, we might actually end up killing them. Whereas a doctor has a different obligation, right? They'd have an obligation.
Yeah, he has taken an oath to do no harm. Whereas we have the Good Samaritan Act in Canada, so we do actually have an obligation to help people. We are protected by the Good Samaritan Act here.
That's great.
But if you're not trained or ethically able to help and you kill somebody, there's still a chance that legally you may be responsible for their death, even though you tried to help them.
Yeah.
So
So
there's kind of a fine line to walk there.
and so even ask you that line, for example, or say to me, okay, Kai, what do you know to help that person? And I go, I know the emergency phone number. Okay, that's your job. Your job is, as a Stoic, is to do what's morally right, is to phone the ambulance and stay with that person, keeping them warm and on their side until the ambulance arrives. That is your moral responsibility. Why? Because you should be self-controlled enough to know that you're not a doctor. You should know about the facts of science that, okay, I need to keep them on their side because that is probably the safest thing. They might go into shock, so keeping them warm would be helpful. But if I go beyond my expertise, right, because I get emotional and think I can be a hero when I can't, or I get too scared and run away when I shouldn't, then that's when Stoicism says that actually that was a lack of wisdom and lack of self-control on your part because you didn't really think things through. So I said to me, Stoicism is really important when you have an emergency situation, go, what is my duty? Because Stoicism isn't about rights. In this society, particularly victim culture, we talk a lot about rights. I have a right to this. I have a right to be angry. I have a right to retweet. And Stoicism says, no, we don't have rights. In Stoicism, there are really no rights. It's about, I have obligations. So the more powerful I get, the more followers I get on social media, the more responsibility I have, right? Because my influence is greater. So Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius had different obligations. Rights is
Right.
such an alien thing to Stoicism. It doesn't exist, really.
Well, I mean, you have to remember Marcus Aurelius is known as one of the last great emperors, or the 5 last great emperors of Rome. And he inherited a lot of problems. He had barbarians, he had a bitchy wife, he had kids dying on him,
He
and
had a plague.
he still had spent the time to write down. He wrote the journal for himself as a reminder, what it meant to, as he says, to be a good, don't ask what a good man is, just be one. And he had a lot on his plate at a very difficult time in Roman history, and he came off as a philosopher king, and he did it with a lot of grace. And he also had a lot of teachers. He thanks his grandfather and all those teachers at the very beginning of meditations. He's got to, be thankful for your teachers, right?
I think Marcus. I mean, we talk about Marcus Aurelius a lot in the in the book. In one of the chapters, we tell his story, and I just want to tell you one because Christians tend to give Marcus Aurelius a really bad rap. They say that he killed Christians in the gladiator battles. If you know anything about the ancient history, you'll find out that people mocked Marcus Aurelius because he made gladiators use blunt swords because he didn't want them to kill each other. So I find it really, really odd that Christians kind of like Christian literature, which is a lot older than what actually was happening at the time, says that Marcus Aurelius was quite barbaric by throwing them to the lions. When actually he hated he hated gladiatorial
Well, I'm pretty sure Marcus Aurelius hated the whole idea of the games completely altogether.
he, he did.
I'm pretty sure he thought that was a waste of time and resources, and as
He
he should.
We talk about this in the book, but actually, one of the things that he does is when there's like a mutiny against him, he bans the city from having sports for 2 years. He's like, okay, you went against me. I'm the emperor. You know what your punishment is? No gladiatorial games for you. No chariot races. How dare you? And people often say, "I'm like, that's actually what he did." Does that sound like a emperor who threw Christians to the lions? Because that literature from Christian, Christian, old Christian history is a lot later. Like the guy was mocked. It must have been quite annoying to be mocked, openly mocked by the ruling class for being sort of like, you know, quite a weak character in terms of sport. They did like their blood sport, and he was like, no, I've had enough of blood in my day job. I don't find any joy in watching any more bloodshed on for fun.
Right. If you're on campaign for the last 5 years, the last thing you want to see it is in your backyard.
And unnecessarily as well. So I find it really, really interesting that he has this like bad reputation in certain Christian circles. But when I dug deeper, it was like, no, because he was literally mocked for the opposite. So I found it quite interesting that people, they hear something, and again, it's not based in fact, and so they might say, "Oh, I don't want to be a Stoic," and I've heard this, "I don't want to be a Stoic because Marcus Aurelius was Stoic and he was anti-Christian." And it's like, actually, he wasn't really. I wouldn't say he was pro-Christian. He was probably not really interested because of what you've just said. He was on campaign, and that wasn't really his priority. But he certainly wasn't anti-Christian. But it doesn't make any sense. In fact, whenever he had to bless, a river and keep people happy in terms of their gods, he would do that as the Roman emperor. Even though when he writes in his journal, which we now call Meditations, he reflects on the Stoic god, Stoic theology, and other types of theology. But he did do his role. He was kind of like the Queen will go and the Queen of the UK will go and cut a ribbon and do appearances. He was all for doing the appearances for the sake of the king, sake of his empire. But it was not that he necessarily believed that himself. So I think that's really great that you've also done some studies in that. I like that.
I was going to say, because the question I have here from the forum is who are the three people that have been the most influential to you, whether that they're Stoic or just general people? Who have they been, because Marcus likes to shout out to the people who influenced him. And so I'm going to give you your chance to do the same thing.
Yeah, I like this question because people expect me to give a slightly different answer, I suppose. But I always say my grandmother, my mother, and my partner. I'm not going to say I'm not influenced by people much more external to me, but the persons who have been there day in, day out through my childhood and adulthood, I can't say that I've been influenced more by anybody else. And I think it's really important to, again, see facts, because I see a lot of people say they're influenced by somebody, and I'm like, are you influenced by that person or the image of that person? So,
that's right. We have an image of a person in our mind, right? But that image of the person, I've just learned this recently through my art of communication, relationships, and leadership, is that the image of the person you have in your mind is not the person. It's just the image that you have in your mind of that person.
It's actually really damaging, because if when now you're in these circles, you have dinner with people, and you had what you had in your mind of who they were and then who they are is two different things, and then your disappointment is your problem. So I've sat years ago and had dinner with enough people who are famous, and for you just like me. There's no difference to you. Then really, we're basically the same. You just have a slightly different story, and sometimes that story, what the story they tell in their book, is actually quite different to the story they tell you in person. So I've read a lot of books that say I did A, B, C, and D to get where I am, and then when I queried that, because I did some more research, they're like, well, that's not exactly how it happened. I didn't tell you that I paid $3,000 to get an agent, or I paid this to get a marketing campaign, and that's when there's almost always a key connection or a pot of money that they failed to mention in that if you follow these 10 steps, you'll be successful. Which again,
wow, that's the reason why I stopped following Robert Kiyosaki, because he's got some good ideas, but his story is bullshit.
I don't know his story. Tell me his story.
Well, Robert Kiyosaki wrote Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and then Cash Flow Quadrant. And he had the idea that you should become an investor and not work in a business, work on a business. These are great concepts. However, his idea, his story of, having two dads, like a rich dad and a poor dad, all that shit is completely fictitious. It's a made up story. Oh. You know what I mean? It's Robert Kiyosaki, but it's the legend. It's not the man, right? The legend when you talk about the legend is different than talking about the man, right? Because the legend is what the history books or whatever say about the person. The man is who they are behind closed doors. Right. And I think behind closed doors, no offense. Well, actually, all offense to Robert Kiyosaki, I think he's a dick. So
it's really dangerous, actually. And in chapter 1, we say, Leo and I, as a co-author, and I say, we don't know your story. The 10 steps that would work for us will not work for you. Why? Because we live in a different country, we're different, we might be different ages, we have different skill sets. So in the book, what we ask people to do is ask themselves better questions. The quality of your life is defined by the questions you get to ask yourself. Some of them you can't help it. So a poorer person, as in economically poorer, not spiritually or emotionally, would say, "Where am I going to eat today? What am I going to eat today?" And that's a very fundamental question, like you said, right?
Food security
Exactly.
and shelter.
And that question tells you a lot about the quality of their life, right? And then when we get up to, as you're like a Maslow's hierarchy, you'll say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, do I have to get stressed out about the fact that A, B, or C happened? Right? So we say, for example, you had an excellent question about if I was in your shoe, if you were in my shoes, what would you do?
What
What
would I?
question
Yeah,
would you ask yourself?
exactly. Yeah.
Can you say
Go
the
ahead.
question? Sorry, I think I've butchered your question.
The question is if you could step into my shoes, what would you have asked yourself that I did not?
Yeah, and I love that question because it's the wrong question. I actually really love it because people ask that question a lot, and I'm like, if I'm in your shoes, my feet won't fit. Like we need to start asking people, what would you do in my shoes? Because it's like, well, my shoes are not your shoes. I'm not you. You need to ask yourself, what should I do in my shoes? That's all. And so I can advise you, but I should always have the proviso. This is my advice and what I would do given who I am, if what I think your situation is would apply to me. Because again, we might not really fully understand the situation. And that doesn't mean that I can't give you advice. But the problem I have with a lot of self-help books, which we really shied away from, is actually we critique self-help. So I feel like our book would be like kicked off the self-help bookshelf for like biting the hand that feeds it. But it's like we critique that concept because we say, we're going to give you some principles we want you to think about. We want to help you ask yourself better questions. But we can't help you be a better person because you're a completely different person and you're completely different circumstances. So people will say, for example, in self-help books, if you do A, B, and C, Tony Robbins is a really good example of this. And I'm like, yeah, but I live in the UK or I live in Portugal. We don't have those opportunities. I can't borrow that money to buy a house. I can't get that loan.
Well, I get that a lot because I'm in the bigger pockets community for real estate in the States, and they have access to the FHA loans, which is 5% down. But in Canada, it's 20% down, bare minimum. Doesn't matter. They won't give you a mortgage, right?
Exactly. Here we had to give 50% of this is the house's mortgage, and I had to get 50% of the capital. 50. So like, none of the stories that Tony Robbins says about how to be wealthy make any sense to anybody outside of the US. And even if you're in the
Well,
US, it might not make sense to you because you're in a different situation. And that's the danger because they'll say if you follow the 10 steps that I do, like you'll get A, B, and C. So I give a really good example. Like Leo is 6 foot tall. I'm 5'5", right? I'm really small. And if he tells me, Kai, success is getting a toilet roll from the top shelf. I go, great. What do I have to do? Okay, stand there, lift your hands up and grab it. And I can imagine myself doing that and going, I can't reach. Like, no, believe you can reach. Believe you can reach that toilet roll. And you're like, and I use that example because it's so silly. I'm believing, I believe it. Very sort of Tony Robbins stuff. I'm believing. It's like, are your arms growing? No, they're not. So because, in his case, he doesn't need a step ladder, and I do. If someone told me, well, if you use a step ladder, you'll reach it, right? But self-help books say if you follow me exactly, you'll get whatever you want, whatever I'm telling you can get. And if you don't do it, it's because you didn't follow my steps properly, and that's such a dangerous thing. That sends you back into a doomer spiral if ever I saw one.
you know what? I've been there because I originally read the Tim Ferriss's 4 Hour Work Week in 2012. And that was just when I was like on my self exploration journey living in Quebec at the time. And then I noticed that Chris Gilbo had he not the forward, but he put a recommendation on your book. And I used to follow Chris Gilbo as well. And then I realized that his whole thing only works for Chris Gilbo. It doesn't work for anybody else. His whole travel hacking, the freedom, what's it called, the world domination conference in Portland, all those things, and that's what happened to me in my middle 20s. Is I was like, I tried to implement all of these things, but I didn't have the skills, the background, the training, or the knowledge,
Or the network.
or the network to fully implement it all. And I've tried like several times. Like podcasting has been like a godsend for me because I do not like being in front of the camera. YouTube, like I used to try and do YouTube, but I'm not a YouTube person. I don't mind having my voice out there, but I don't like sitting in front of a camera. And I used to try and follow YouTube gurus that would be like, you just have to vlog 5 times a week, and this'll be your golden ticket sort of bullshit. And same like Kong, fuck you, Kong, you're an asshole. Anyways, no offense. Like I have a whole people, like I call it like my doomer shit list. Like I have a whole list of people that I will not like my vibe attracts my tribe. And it's not that I didn't take some of their knowledge and apply it, but it's like you mentioned earlier, if you follow that 5 steps or 10 steps to whatever their version of success is, in quotation marks, success is individual. Like success for me, like nowadays, is like, did I eat today? Check. Did I wake up at the time I wanted to? Check. Did I take my medication? Check. Okay, that's success for my day, right? But it could, I have other benchmarks for success, obviously, but I'm saying like on just a universal daily success, it's more important to be, like I said, do you have food? Do you have security? And yeah, do you have your three basic necessities? If you have those 3 basic necessities, okay, that's success, and you can be grateful for that. This, like, what would I call it? I would call it like there's a difference between being successful and being a show off. All right. And some people have forgotten what it was like to be a doomer, I think, in these higher level communities of the planet, and they have some great ideas, but they've forgotten what it was like being at the bottom. They've gotten to the point where they've become out of touch with reality, where what every day-to-day human beings are living through. And I don't want to name any names because I do have a list of names. And this show is not about a vendetta. It's not like that. It's just about showing people that there is a different way and a more well-rounded way of living your life. And if I can have a discord with Kai, as we're having, and even if we don't agree on something, I can say, Kai, I agree to disagree with you. And Kai will be like, okay, I'm either William does not have the willingness, the capability, or the capacity to take in what I'm saying right now, right? Maybe we'll come around to that at a different time, but I'm not going to become offended that Kai didn't understand me or didn't want to take in my opinion, and vice versa. And I don't know. That's just, go ahead.
I wanted to ask you, really, because I do love your tattoo, right? But I think, like with the yes thing, right? I think knowing what you say yes to, because you're very insightful, if you don't mind me saying it. Like, it is very, very necessary. This podcast is very necessary, and maybe you call your school the tribe, right? It is necessary to grab the tribe and show them, like, exactly what you said. Like, if I say yes to, say, Chris Gilboo's like story, does that help me? And yes, he has some excellent ideas, right? And he read the book and he thought it was really helpful. So, but I do feel that, yes, sometimes the context that they're in is so alien to 95% of the UK/US, Canada. So I'm not even talking about Africa. I'm not even going there. It's so alien to the reality that it's actually unhelpful. So I wanted to ask you about your tattoo. Like, would you still, would you put it on yourself today or not?
My tattoo?
Yeah. So you better. I suppose you better tell people what the tattoo says.
For those listeners who don't know, I have a tattoo on my right arm that says "Yes, Man" in red letters, yes, and man in blue. and then I have my birth date, and it's a reminder to be open-minded. When I was in my early 20s, I was in a phase where I was open-minded to everything. I would take in new concepts, ideas on a daily, monthly, yearly basis and try to integrate them. But in the process of that journey, there's a point where I call it information. It's called not information overload, but it's the cup is full. There's a certain point where the cup is full, and you won't be able to take any more. And the Tao Te Ching says, when the cup is full, stop pouring. And I'm at the point in my life now at 31, and I've lived. It's taken me a decade, basically from 21 to 31, to come up with my own 10-pillar framework, as I'm calling it. But as I mentioned, it's not for everyone. It's for doomer bloomers. It's for people who have been down in the doomer pit of despair for multiple periods of their life and have also upcycled from that despair and also want to give back and contribute to the world. And those are the type of people I'm looking for this podcast. On that note, and I don't want to because this is I feel like I'm doing way too much talking. This is kind of Kai's time. But after this episode, if you want to come on the podcast as a contributor or part of the Doomer Bloomer collective, as I'm calling it, you really need to read my matchmaker profile and go to the section that says Doomer Bloomer support. All right. And you need to make a $10, $15, or $25 donation to my GoFundMe page so I can keep the lights on around here and start pushing out really awesome content like we're discussing with Kai.
I don't mind. I mean, to be fair, this is your space. And I think that I've tried to show your audience. Again, this is my issue with podcasts in general. Sometimes the guest gets too much, right? The guest gets too much attention, and the audience isn't actually here necessarily for me, right? William, they're here because they believe in the message, right? And I think as a podcaster, sometimes that gets forgotten, and it's not about making the audience, putting the audience in a better place or helping them get there. It's really about sending, the message of the book. And although I've referred to it, I think it's very important that I didn't speak so much about the book does this, the book does that, because at the end of the day, it's not about me, is it? My journey in the book, I learned from writing the book, right? I learned about myself, but the journey is for your audience. And I actually think it's very important in podcasts in general that we reflect on that. And it's something that I don't really see very often, which is why I try to ask, questions to the host, because people tune in because of you. They don't tune in because of me, right? It's just the truth. And unfortunately, because of the cult of celebrity, which we've been discussing.
Hey, Kalpna, if you're listening, I'm smiling right now.
But it's true, because in the cult of celebrity, we kind of give too much to, say, the podcast guest. And it should be a dialogue, right? In Stoicism, we talk about Socratic dialogue. I'm learning from you, you're learning from me. If I'm open to the opportunity, and Stoicism is about being open within reason. It's always about within reason and the virtues of being open to your learning, right? And it's not about that I have to take your opinion. I just have to say, okay, what serves me and what doesn't. And in the self-help space, it's really one directional. And that's wrong. In my view, that's wrong. Because it's not about a dialogue with somebody in the self-help space. It's about, I've made it, you're down there, you don't know what you're doing. If you listen to me, if you believe, no. If you listen to me, some of it will help. But other people equally help. My book says, I don't give you any answers, because your answers are your answers. You shouldn't be interested in my answer. You should be interested in your own answer. It's by reading the book and reflecting about what your answer is that you find the knowledge that you need, and you find the wisdom that you require to move forward. So, William, I have no issue whatsoever. I'm really glad that you gave yourself that space, because I think also it's about hearing yourself, right? It's about your audience clicking and finding their identity in this podcast. If I'm here to, in my view, in my opinion, but I'm here to facilitate that. I'm here to facilitate the community, because that's what the book is about. It's about I want to be a better person to make the world better. How do I make the world better in my role? Reaching out to you and giving you, the opportunity to talk about what matters to you. And I think, I don't know, but I'll have to ask you your opinion as a podcast. I think we've lost that somehow. It's all about the guest and not about the rest, as in the majority of the people listening to this podcast who find something really helpful. I will come and go. They may never hear my voice again. I hope that you guys do hear my voice again. I hope I get invited back. But you may never hear my voice again. But they will hear yours, William, and that's the voice they need to be, help build you. Build you, no, sorry, build your community into something that is functional for them. Because you're right, if people don't invest either time or effort or money, whatever their role is in that community doesn't exist. And that's what we're losing, because self-help isn't about the self. It is fundamentally about being a better person to give yourself, you call it bandwidth or headspace, to do the right thing for the right reason at the right moment.
Well, and that's what you just kind of nailed it. It's a community. The Doomer Bloomer podcast is a community. It's about community and sharing ideas. And as I mentioned earlier, you will be invited back, Kai, because you're sharing and you're willing to have a discourse with me that a lot of other people aren't willing to have. Just because they're in the mindset of what can I get out of this, not what can I give to this. And I was just talking about this morning on my other podcast, The Daily Taoist, and it was verse 7, and it says basically, don't be selfish, and that's the essence of verse 7. Don't be selfish, and be a go-giver, not a go-getter, because the Tao Te Ching says that the more you give to the universe, the more will flow back to you in return. And it's really that simple. The world works on circulation, whether that be money, energy, feelings. It works on circulation. The more you put out, the more will flow back to you. It's a circular system.
Yeah, we just the caveat is like the only caveat I would add is like the more you give within reason, because sometimes we get the martyr syndrome as well. Like if you give and give and give, and like basically you go to the bottom of the cup and you've given so much, then obviously it's finding the balance. I mean, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about cyclical, if I'm not mistaken, cyclical balances between giving and receiving. And again, the self-help space is, I feel like it's ceasing to become about the audience and becoming about being a cult-like figure. And I hope like I've been able to dispel that, at least in what Stoicism presents, because that's not what Marcus Aurelius was talking about. The Meditations was never published from his point of view, right? It was his fourth process.
Yeah, it was his own personal diary that got picked up much later.
So I wanted to ask you possibly like one final question, really, because I think it's fundamentally important in terms of like your community. Like if we fast forward the clock, 6 months, let's say 6 months, because we're in still in a COVID situation, and I come back on the podcast, what does that community look like to you? Your community, what does that look like?
What is the Doomer Bloometer? Well, hopefully it'll be 10x by the end of the year. That is my goal. Like I would like to have contributors from all over the globe, people who have very diverse backgrounds of information, and they're not go-getters, they're go-givers. They're out to contribute for the world, not just for themselves. They're looking at the world from a perspective of, how can I provide value and be of value? Maybe I may be a doomer. Maybe I've been in that negative headspace, but we all cycle. We cycle through that doomer to bloomer continually, right? It can be a 3-month cycle, a 6-month cycle, but we cycle through it.
And what would be your advice to somebody who's like, I'm sorry if I'm stealing the show of this, but what would be your advice to someone who's like, do I want to join the community or not? What would you say to them? Like, what would be like, someone sitting on the fence and it has got nothing to do with Stoicism. They listen to your podcast the last couple of weeks. What would you say to them? Like, okay, you're on the fence. Like, what would be your message to them?
My my soft sell would be check out my daily Twitter feed, because I give lots of nuggets of wisdom there for free. I put useful links to how to start YouTube channels. I put useful links to how to start WordPress sites. All of those links are completely for free. They do help the channel if you click on them. But all those resources are out there and freely available to you. I do have a Patreon page, but ultimately I'm trying to build a community, and a community only works, as we've been discussing, is if we have a back and forth dialogue, and we have a framework, as I like to call it, of mutual understanding between us. So it doesn't feel like, hey, I'm getting screwed here and I'm not getting any value back for my time and my energy. Right? If you spend an hour with me listening to a podcast, because we're getting over the hour mark, but I'm going to let it flow because this is a good conversation, and I can just break the podcast into 2 parts or whatever. But I look at the Doomer Bloomer community as being for the world to better understand ourselves, our internal workings, and how to come to a mutually beneficial agreement, or, for lack of a better word, contract, like a social contract that says, let's not try and stab each other in the back. Let's just try and understand where we're coming from. And if we disagree, we can agree to disagree. And then we'll come back and rehash that out when we have the willingness, the capability, and the bandwidth to do that.
I mean, I really like what you're saying, because it's fundamentally what I'm trying to say in one of the chapters. And you said you like this bit of, put people in circles, not boxes. So in Stoicism, you start with the self, and you grab the next circle out, which is family, and you grab the next circle out, which is community, and you grab the next circle out, which is humanity, and you grab the circle out, what we added at the co-author and I, which is the earth, and until basically you see yourself in all of humanity and in the earth, and you see the earth as part of you. And I really like the fact that you are saying, like, we need to reach out, we need to, grab hold of, the next one along and bring it into ourselves and reflect on that. Because, there is a lot of sort of self-serving ideas. And there's nothing wrong in Stoicism. We don't say it's wrong to be selfish. It's not wrong to be selfish if you are standing on the platform of the 4 virtues. Because if you're being just, courageous, self-control, and wise, then your selfishness will be beneficial. It's when your compass is facing the wrong way and you're selfish that you're actually doing a lot of damage. So I think you agree, I think you're saying, you can be selfish if you understand fundamentally that your selfishness needs to drive forward communal goals, right? If you can say, okay, I'm really good at this, let me do this. Let me do this one thing. Let me do it for you because I'm really good at, say, writing. That might be, quote unquote, selfish to somebody. We say, I'm doing this for the common good. And this is a concept that people don't like to talk about because they always think it's a zero-sum game. Stoicism says there is no zero-sum game. That's a theory. People, again, fact and fiction. There is powerful people like to say there's a zero-sum game. Right? They like to say this. Yeah. And it's not necessarily true. It's not necessarily, I mean, there are some essence, like, chess would be a very good example of a zero-sum game. You either win or you lose, and it is literally black and white. But in reality, like outside of these very small examples, it is not a zero-sum game. In Stoicism, it says the zero-sum game is when you think that you have to win at all costs because you lose. That's the zero-sum game in Stoicism. That's it, because in Stoicism, again, for example, there's no oppression. The only person who can be oppressed is yourself. The oppressor and the oppressed are both oppressed because they both don't have the ability to react to reality, because either the oppressor is doing something and they are taking that in as true, therefore oppressing themselves, or the oppressor thinks that's true. And again, that could be a victim culture person, who sometimes can be the oppressor. There was a good example of yogurt this week about using a trigger to quote unquote oppress somebody. And I think we're losing that reality, William. I really do. And I really admire your courage to stand literally and say, look, I'm doing a podcast, I'm getting content, Like, help me build this community. There's not many podcasters who would be so blunt and direct, but I think that's a wake up, a reality call. Like, if you want more of this content, you have to understand something. It takes my time. You and I spent like money and time and effort, back and forth with the messages. And people sometimes think that, it's for free, right? It's for free. That's how it's it.
I mean, I mean, nothing's really for free. I do it because I enjoy doing it, but you have to understand that I'm building a community that needs to become self-sustaining at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm really building towards. I've been doing this for close to 2 years now, right? And I wasn't sure what direction it was going to take when I first started it. It was more of for me at that time, because I was being selfish and I was building my own little island of 4 virtues to stand on. But I have that island built now. I have that self island where Will it's called Will no Will's land. No Will's land. It is Will stands on that island. Sometimes John comes on and helps me on the island. And now we're going to get to the next circle to make that island a little bit bigger. And we're going to just start building the island one section at a time, one circle at a time.
I think it's fundamental to, in terms of that, is to understand your core identity and understand your core audience. And I do think they will resonate with you being very direct, because you are a very direct person. And I think that's really important, because sometimes, again, like, people say, I can't, for example, I'm not going to do that, or I can't afford it, or why should I pay for that? And you say, well, if you don't pay for what you value, and it's not, if they're on your...
let me just throw this at you. Do you pay for Sam Harris content?
Me, I don't. I'm not a Sam Harris fan, but I know people that do.
Well, I used to, until he completely I applaud what Sam Harris kind of did, because he's kind of like the NPR of podcasts, but at the same time, like there's two kinds of schools of thought on this. You can be like the whole Tim Ferriss model, and we basically try and monetize everything, and I'll endorse everything underneath the sun, which I don't really like, because I don't really give a shit about MeUndies, frankly. And then there's the Sam Harris model. There's a subscription model. So there's basically two ways we can go about this guy, or we can make a blended model, right? If you sign up to the Patreon page, it's $7.50 Canadian a month. It's less than a cup of coffee. And if you're getting value for the podcast, we're over 30 episodes, closer to 50 episodes now in the last 2 years, and if you've heard my voice enough, I tweet daily, and I'm on all social media daily, not myself, but I use tools that help me do that. And I'm very approachable. However, there has to be a reciprocity here, where you give value for time and time for value, or vice versa, right? And yeah, I never really meant to go down this track, but I guess on my doomer walk this morning, I kind of coalesced some dormant information that I've been working on in the back of my hindbrain. And I really love doing this podcast, guys. But if you want us to keep the lights on, the community of people that I know in my immediate family, and then the circle out from there, if you hear my voice on a regular basis and you're getting value from it, Will needs some support too, is what I'm asking. And it's not a whole lot of support. It's like $10 to my GoFundMe, or $10 to my Patreon page. If you go to the next subscriber level up, I'll send you an Alexa delivered straight to your house for $69 a month. But $7.50 cup of coffee a month would go a long way.
I don't know. I mean, it's important. I mean, again, like, as I said, and it's something that what I stand in terms of the book is to say, like, we need to be wiser in how we approach self-help, right? We need to approach it from a communal standpoint. Like, and I say that, we should stand with our heroes and realize they're humans too, right? So I completely get what you're saying. Like, I do this, on that one level you do it for love, but eventually there has to be some moment where you get recognition, right? And unfortunately or fortunately, in the way the economic situation is set up, is that most of that recognition is through some level of some kind of financial support, right? So people often, it's really strange that people go, oh, say William's asking for financial support, right? They're just not used to it. But as you said, like they wouldn't. People don't question like if they went and bought this T-shirt of Jacksonville Jaguars. We don't question that.
Well, and here's the other thing. Like I have a TeePublic store, I have a Teespring store. If you're if you want a physical Doomer Bloomer COVID mask, you can get one. You just go to my TeePublic link. I tweet them all the time. They're on every single podcast episode that comes out. You go to the Doomer Bloomer store, you'll get some swag. So you're getting value. I'm providing value, and it's a reciprocity. And I honestly, in the deepest heart of my hearts, I love and I care about everyone, right? And especially what I feel the Doomer Bloomer community is going to become. Just in the last 3 or 4 months alone, the amount of people that I have on my own personal mailing list now, like I said, they're going to be lifelong friends or collaborators, right? Because we're all connecting those islands throughout time and space is basically what we're doing.
So how do we join? How do you join the dots there? You've got because that's the thing that I feel the podcast and the community needs to work on, right? You've got these dots of people. Yeah, how are you going to cement the nodes to each other? Because I think that's fundamental. That people have to understand. Like, okay, I'm an individual listening to a podcast, but how can they really feel part of a community?
You need to join the Doomer Bloomer Discord group that I've set up, and you need to join or sign up to my newsletter that I've started putting out. Sign up to my email list, join the Discord group, and start flowing me what sort of things and what sort of topics and people you want to hear about. Like if I'm on Twitter and you see, hit me up on Twitter, we can shoot the shit, and I can, just start engaging with me. I think that's pretty much where it starts. Just start engaging. Like I'm very approachable. Unless you're completely trying to sell me Bitcoin or something like that, I'm very approachable. Don't try and sell me Bitcoin. Okay. I don't give a shit about Bitcoin. There's way better cryptocurrencies out there.
Well, thank you. Well, I must actually go, but I'm really pleased that we had this conversation. I think it was a very real, raw conversation. It's a really rare privilege to be able to, have on some level, a professional heart to heart and really talk about things that matter. To really sort of look closely at how we examine in community what's real and what's not. And I think you were really real with your audience, and I personally appreciate that you were real with me, and I think it's great that you could put your heart on your sleeve and say, look, guys, this is really important, because if you don't say it, people don't know.
You need to ask for what you want, and I've been learning that lately. I do have one last question for you, though.
Cool. Tell me now. Go on.
What is your zombie plan, Kai?
Yeah, that really threw me. That was a really interesting question. I don't even have an answer. I've been thinking about it. I still don't have an answer. What's yours?
I'm moving to the Yukon and building a border defense wall.
I'll move with you. That's my plan.
Yeah, that's my other podcast, Yukon Gold Podcast.
We can bring the community with us. We can all win the zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, if you're a prepper, that's definitely where you need to be.
Well, thank you, Remy. And again, I really appreciate that you were raw, that you really spoke to your audience. It's been a privilege, and I thank you that I was able to facilitate that for you. And yeah, invite me back on and let me know, the audience, let me know what you guys think. I'm sure you would forward any mail that they ask, any questions they ask. And yeah, please consider helping William out. It's nice to get someone who's very sincere and who really wants to help the community. And he's working his way through my books. I think some of those ideas will at least help him give the questions, get hold of the questions he needs. Because again, I said there's no universal answer really. So yeah, I really wish you the best, and I really hope in 6 months' time I can see like some cement between the nodes and that your community is bigger and stronger for you being real and authentic. I would say you're very authentic with them today, and I appreciate that. Thank you very much for having me on, William.
Thanks, Kai. And you can follow Kai at stoickai.com. And what is your Twitter handle, Kai?
At Kai Whiting. So yeah.
At Kai Wisely. And I am always, I am at the Doomer Bloomer podcast and Bill_ETE on Twitter or on Facebook, YouTube, all of the social medias, minus TikTok. No offense to TikTok, but don't go there. Talk about that at a later time. And you can always check us out at www.thedoomerbloomerpodcast.com. Especially go to become a member. Consider joining the Patreon. The GoFundMe page, minimum $10 donation. It's tax refundable, right? You can write it off in your taxes. There's nothing you can go wrong there. And I love each and every one of you. And remember that just because you're a doomer doesn't mean you don't have the bloomer inside of you. It's all part of the same spectrum. Have a great and prosperous day. Namaste from Will S.
If you're listening to this, just a quick question. What is your zombie plan? Let me know on Twitter at Bill_Summer, at Doomer Bloomer or Doomer Podcast on Twitter. Hashtag Zombie Plan by Bill ETE.